Time has come to remove the after portion of the skeg piece, which has been permanently bonded, at least up to this point here, to the port side of the stern. It's best to do this cutting operation with a razor saw. Very, very thin blade, very little offset to the blades. As a consequence, the kerf is very, very small, on the order of a 64th of an inch. So we're not going to lose much material. The best way to mount this thing preceding the cut is to actually assemble the two hull halves to give me a more rigid structure. Also, it's easier to handle like this. I'll just hold it together with rubber bands, like so. There we are. Alright, so I've already marked where I'm going to be making the cut. So we're going to observe that as I cut a vertical line down to where the skeg piece meets the major portion of the skeg, which is a molding, an integral part of the stern. So we're going to cut here, and that should free up this piece. It should just come off in my hands. So I've already got a start here, and we'll just work on making this vertical. Got to hold it to keep from chattering here. Periodically I'll rotate it over, see how we're doing on the cut. Keep at it. Almost there. There it is. Good. Literally falls apart. Clean up the little bit of kerf hanging off there. I think I can do that with some sandpaper in the form of this tool, sanding stick. Alright, now this is a very important issue. This piece that I've just removed now will give me access to both the rudder and the stern planes. Because as you can see, the stern planes, half of the operating shaft crutches within that bearing. See that? Get this out of the way. Alright. Not only that, but there's a hole which comprises the middle bearing for the rudder. The rudder fits like so onto this skeg piece, and if I'm dexterous enough, I can run the rudder operating shaft here, which is still wild, through that hole and down through the rudder. And as you can see, this one skeg piece becomes a bearing for not only the rudder but the stern planes. So it's a vital element in making it removable. That is to say, later it will be secured in place using RTV adhesive, which permits me to break the bond later. That permits me to get access at any time to the rudder or the stern planes. So there you have it. Remove the bottom of the skeg piece from the forward portion of the bottom skeg piece, and it's going to be wild. This is going to be the point that secures both the stern planes and the rudder in place. So what we want to do now is make sure that we have free and unencumbered or unbinding situations between both the stern plane and the rudder operating shafts. But we'll do them one at a time so that it's easier to identify any binding issues. We'll start with the stern planes. Now what I'm going to do is take the stern plane and crutch it as it should be within the bearing. And the bearing is constituted by this deal here, these two ends, as you can see, I'm using a 1/8 inch file because we're going to need this later. It forms the bearing, but it's 1/2 of the bearing. The other half of the bearing, of course, is part of the skeg piece, the removable skeg piece. And without the stern planes, you can see how it fits here. Goes together and traps, if you will, the stern plane operating shaft into position. So without further ado, we'll drop it in there. Notice the nub here on top of the operating shaft that makes up to our bell crank later. So again, I want you to see how this works. We crutch the stern plane operating shaft into 1/2 of the bearing, and then we place this component of the skeg in place. And I'm applying pressure because it's wild now. I'm applying pressure to hold it down with my thumb. And now I operate the stern planes and I feel quite a bit of binding. It's tight. It shouldn't be. It should be loose. Now it's good it's not loose, but it's hanging up. When we close up on the work, we find that there are some anomalies in the casting. You can see those clearly close up. This area here and here. And what I'm going to do now is use that 1/8 inch round file, and I'm going to place it in here initially and just make a few passes. Just a few. Because I don't want to wear down the outboard points. So what I'm going to do is favor the inside. I'm cutting here, not here. Good. I'm going to turn the work around, and we'll do the same here. Angling it up a little bit. Angling it up. And then taking some swipes with this 1/8 inch round file. Good. So we're knocking that burr off of there. We're going to take our piece here. Now it doesn't evidence any problems. I can lay that file in there, take a few passes, and it looks pretty good. So we're going to leave that alone. Alright, we're going to put this back together. Let me back off here. Good. Stern plane, correctly oriented, put it in there. Then lay in our skeg piece to lock it in place. Place our thumb on there. Still tight, very, very tight. Now I'm checking this for wobble, and there's no wobble. That's good. Now I'm really, really clamping down here, really hard, and it moves without too much binding, but still there's enough binding for me to be concerned. So I'm going to repeat the process. This time I'm going to lay it in there flat, and I'm applying pressure this way. Then I'm going to be applying pressure this way with the file to increase the diameter slightly of the bearing. And I'm going to do the same to this piece here. I want to overdo it because I don't want those stern planes to be terribly loose. Now I'm repeatedly cycling the planes, and what I'm looking for now is a shiny spot on the bearings. And that, of course, will be where we're making contact and we have to remove some material. Alright, so I'm going to get right in there and take a look. Looking for a shiny spot. Nothing there. Yes, I see it here. I have to remove some material. Okay, get my a round file. Get right in there. I think we'd be better off putting this down. Yeah. Taking off on the inboard side of this channel. Good. All right. Again. Much better, much better. And no wobble to speak of. Good. All right, I'm happy with that. The stern planes now need equipped to them to the operating shaft a bell crank. Now, this is a non-traditional bell crank because of the very tight confines offered by the model. As you can see, we have already cut a V groove into the stern, and I've done this on both halves. This will permit the angular displacement of the bell crank within an acceptable amount to give me good deflections of the stern planes. The bell crank is a piece of wire which I've heated and pounded to a flat and attached to this clevis. And what we want is to drill a hole in the nub on the operating shaft of the stern planes to accept our bell crank. And that's what I'm doing here. I've got a little moto drill all set up, and I'm going to get in there and very carefully drill a 1/16 inch hole, which equates, of course, to the diameter of the bell crank. Good. Blow it out just a little bit. Now, I'm going to go ahead and file, give me a little bit of a bevel at the end of this so I don't have any burrs hanging me up. Alright, I should be able to just drop this right into the hole. There we go. And there you are. Well, we get pretty good down deflection, but you can see that's limited by the physical constraints within. You see how the end of the clevis is hitting the middle bearing for the rudder. We get plenty of rise, which is encouraging when you need it. Alright, there's one trick I can do. That is to actually bend this and give me a little bit of a bias. So what I'm going to do is do just that. I'm going to take my bell crank and bend it just a little bit, reinstall the stern planes here. Alright, we'll try that again, see if we can't get more dive to it this time. There we are. Plenty of dive. Okay, certainly plenty of rise. I'm happy with that. Now you notice, because the distance between the center of rotation on the operating shaft and the point, this is called the moment arm, the point where the clevis makes up to the bell crank, it's rather long. We're going to have an equivalently long moment arm on the servo output bell crank. Alright? That's an unfortunate occurrence, but we can minimize that by lowering, that is, reducing the height of this bell crank, and that's what I'm going to do now. as far as I can take it. And we'll hook it up yet again. Yeah, I think that's about as far as I can take it. But that, we have minimized drastically the height, the moment arm of the bell crank. It'll make life easier when it comes time to hook up the servo linkage. And we're getting adequate amounts of throw, so I'm happy with that. And we have clearance for the rudder, which is all important. All right. The rudder passes through what in essence will be 3 bearings. If I can position the rudder in place here. Bearings constitute the bottom of the skeg, the bearing in the bottom of the hull, and a bearing in the top of the hull. Now, the bearings are installed on this side of the model, and 2 of the bearings are installed, and as you can see, have utility serving as these bearings, like so. And they permit passage of the rudder operating shaft, hold it securely so that it could only rotate in one plane, or about one axis. Right? What's missing here, of course, is the skeg piece, which is now permanently bonded to this haft. This haft does not have the 2 upper bearings, but we need to pass a bearing hole in the bottom of the skeg. And we're going to do that now with a 1/16 inch bit. Center it, and that hole goes right in the tip, like so. All right. I make sure that I can pass the 16th inch shaft through it, fine. And I'll hook up the rudder by, we'll just have to pretend that we have the 2 bearings in top here. We don't, of course, but we install the rudder to girdle the lower bearing. We install the operating shaft through the rudder, which then would run up, of course, into the bearings if they were there, like so. All right? But that skeg is enough to demonstrate that even with just that one point of makeup between hull and rudder, it's enough to be a practical bearing. In concert with the other 2 bearings, this becomes a very stiff and sound securing point for the rudder, permitting it to rotate to achieve its function. So now you can see how this removable skeg piece is vital to getting access once the 2 hull stern hull halves are put together. This will give me access to the rudder and the stern planes. All right. Of course, in reverse, in the case of this, we won't have to have this rudder shaft removable. The shaft will be fixed, and we will entrap the skeg piece, and that's how assembly will occur in the future, like this. Very simple. So having it configured like that, let's go through the drill. Stern plane. Start the rudder. And then get the rudder down on the top bearing. Good. And of course we would then glue that skeg piece in place, and now we can operate the stern planes and the rudder. Push rod. And the bell crank, and as you can see, through motion of the push rod, linear motion, we achieve rotation of the stern plane. I'm incidentally applying significant pressure on the removable skeg piece through the rudder, as you can see here. Stern plane operating shaft, stern plane nub, stern plane bell crank, stern plane clevis, stern plane push rod, rudder operating shaft, removable skeg piece, rudder bell crank. I've temporarily put the rudder and stern planes together for you to get a better idea of how the internal linkages are arrayed within the hull. I have tack glued the stern planes and rudder in place. You can see to good advantage the stern planes, and particularly how the nub becomes a foundation with its hole for the stern plane bell crank, in turn made up to the stern plane clevis, to the push rod, which runs forward, eventually making up to the watertight cylinder. Taking a look at the rudder linkage, you see the rudder push rod making up to a removable bell crank connected to the rudder operating shaft. The shaft running through an upper bearing, middle bearing, and lower bearing. The lower bearing comprising the removable skeg piece. All of this was done to permit an unobstructed area in which to later install torpedo tubes. As you can see, the rudder push rod is clear by being high. The stern plane push rod is clear by being low. Take a look at this half of the hull. You can see where I've ground out this V-shaped opening, and here you can see why, to make clearance for forward and after travel of the bell crank. Now I've already rough sanded around the edge here and beveled the edge as well, both sides. So nothing left for it but to go ahead and glue this thing in place. Now I'm going to make it easy on myself. I'm going to pre-soften the edges by putting the solvent on them, letting it do its magic, just soften the plastic. Notice I'm using this real big brush here. Holds more of the glue. There. Alright, that done. Our biggest hazard here is tipping over that bottle. That done. I'm just going to stick them together. And I'm going to use some rubber bands as soon as I get some glue down. Of course, it behooves you to make sure everything's lined up well. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to lay in the glue right here. Now, since we put a bevel in there, it's going to hold that glue and not let it dribble. All right, nice and heavy. Nothing subtle about this at all. Good. A slight misalignment there, but I've got time. Now we'll do the top. Same deal. See, I'm not very subtle at all about the application of this glue. Good. All right. I'm just going to wrap a rubber band around this stuff. And we'll continue running the glue around and about. All right. I use a rubber band to hold things tightly together. Good. Now's the time to check again, make sure everything's aligned. There's a slight displacement at the top here, about a 1/64 of an inch. You can see it here, but it's perfectly flat here on the bottom, and that's what I want to preserve, is symmetry on the bottom. Okay. Now I'm going to go on the inside, just like Electric Boat or Newport News would, and weld on the inside as well. Real heavy glue. Good. The work of installing the running gear support starts with identification of where the stern tube opening has to be made. As you know, the kit provided parts are not practical, and the stern tube, in the case of the kit part, terminates at the surface of the hull. It of course has to penetrate the hull, as this replacement part does. You can see that in the completed unit I've put together on the port side. It indeed penetrates and acts as a fairing for the propeller shaft. To mark that out, you take the kit part, and you'll notice that the kit part is indexed with a positive element here and a negative one on the hull. You simply press them together, check for correct alignment of the kit supplied bearing, strut bearing. Once you've ascertained that, you take a pin and you mark out the outline of the stern tube onto the hull. There we go. I'll finish here. So there you have the outline, quite apparent here, and it's symmetrical with the two we've put in over here. Now I don't want to risk damaging any of the running gear I've already installed on the port side, so we'll go ahead and remove that. We'll set it in safe storage, and we'll get on to the task of opening this thing up. If we're on high speed, just take little stabs at it. There we go. Now, you got to keep in mind that your running gear is going to be entering the hull at an angle like this. So we have to really undercut this area here and overcut this area here. So I've pretty well transcended the use of that bit. Now I'm going to use a very coarse file to continue the work. Alright, see if we can get this thing to fit. There we go. Now it's sliding in there. We're getting our first look at how this thing is going to fit. Just from a cursory look, I see that I got to remove more material on the underside here. Might be best now to attack it from the inside, like this. I'll fit it again. Yeah, starting to look right. Of course, we really want to have a handle on it until we can run a shaft down here and affirm that it will place the cast white metal strut bearing in the right position. Now, the white metal strut bearings, the strut component is longer than the kit component. I did that because I want this thing to actually penetrate into the hull and give me a very secure foundation on the strut that penetrates